Okay, thank you, Stephen and Derek, for that discussion. And next up, we take a deep dive in the race to zero. Over the past 6 months, it feels like there's been a weekly, if not daily, announcement regarding companies, investors, or coalitions committing to net zero. So up next, we'll hear how companies are embracing this challenge and looking to lead to a clean, low carbon future. On your screens now, you'll see we've got a packed panel, including Dane Parker, Chief Sustainability Officer at General Motors, Annie Perkins, Senior Director, Green Building and Supply Chain at Sustainable Forest Initiative, Brian Werner, Senior ESG Specialist at S&P Global, Nicolas Beaumont, Vice President, Movin'On, and chairing the discussion is Erik, the Chief Operating Officer at Future 500. As with the other discussions that have been live, they're here to answer your questions. So do use the Q&A box to the side of the stream, and Erik will try and get through some of those questions as the discussion unfolds. But for now, Erik, the virtual stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to Thomson Reuters for bringing us all together and putting on this another compelling event. We have 40 minutes, and it will race by as we discuss how companies are racing to get to net zero. So let's dive in. I'd like to call on Brian right now to kick us off. And really the key question of this panel is, how is your enterprise getting to net zero? Or put another way, how are you accelerating the drawdown economy? So please share goals, Brian, and targets that you have, and provide detail on specifically how you are working toward it. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik, for that. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Werner. I'm with S&P Global, one of the world's leading providers of ratings, benchmarks, indices for the commodities and capital markets. I specifically focus my time on ESG, and the question is about how we're trying to get to net zero. I know that my company, S&P Global, we're on a path to getting to net zero. What I spend my time focusing on, though, is helping clients of S&P Global, in my case, companies, help get to net zero. So what we think about is we're helping companies all along the spectrum of where they might be in their sustainability journey or their ESG journey. And as it relates to climate, a lot of companies really haven't started yet, and they come to us and they say, where do I begin? And we encourage them to see how they're doing versus their peers, to use some free tools that might be out there to help get them started, to understand what material issues are specific to the sectors that they operate in. There's a lot of companies too that they've been doing some sort of environmental calculations, climate calculations, carbon footprinting for years. And what we want to do is take them to the next level. A lot of companies have done great work in disclosing what they emit, but often that's specific to their operations, where for a lot of sectors, if you're not in heavy manufacturing or mining or utilities, a lot of your impacts related to carbon come from outside your fences, outside your buildings, your office space. And what we want companies to understand is how to move the conversation to calculating those impacts. So what's the carbon that might be embedded in the purchases that they buy, or the carbon that's important or that's used or associated with products as they're being used. So we'll help companies to calculate all of those things to really look across their entire value chain. And so when we're thinking about net zero, it's truly encompassing all of the things that they're looking at and that they are contributing in terms of emissions. It's also important to note that a lot of companies in the investor space, or just more generally, the raters and rankers, there's so many of them out there. They are looking at companies and often making assumptions about what impacts are. So we often will tell our clients, if you're not telling your own story, somebody else is doing it for you. So if you're not already thinking about how to quantify your own impacts as it relates to climate, somebody else is perhaps modeling what that impact might be based on simply your revenue and saying, well, we know a lot of information about companies in your sector. You're not disclosing anything, so we're just going to say this is what the expected emissions would be for your company. And in many cases, that could be good. Companies, even if they run to the average, maybe they know they're sub-average, if you will. So average could lift them up. But most of the time when we talk to companies, they want to be better than average. They want to understand how to get to the point where they can calculate what is really material for their organization. And again, tell their own story, much like we're doing at S&P Global. We've been focusing on ESG initiatives for many, many years. We've been acquiring companies like the one that I came from, TrueCost, for the last several years, and really incorporating ESG into what we do as our own business and then taking that out to our clients. So just to bring it back to your question again, there's opportunity, there's tools and resources that are out there for companies to really move along the path to net zero and hopefully get there.
Brian, that's great. Let's move on to Annie right now. We're talking about when we had our prep call about forest-focused collaboration, and both from within the forest landscape as well as in the built environment. And Annie, I'd love to encourage you to talk about how you're helping to drive to net zero, both with the companies you work with and at SFI.
Very good. Thanks so much, Eric. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for having us today. We're delighted to be here. At SFI, it is our mission to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaborations, and we do that by working in 4 different streams of work. Standards, forest management standards, chain of custody standards. Most people know us for that. We also do a lot of work in conservation impact, environmental education, as well as community engagement work. We all know that companies are seeking solutions that not only reduce their negative impacts, but they want to make positive contributions to of our planet and people, and we all know that that needs to be done. And since our mission guides all the work that we do, we are helping to solve today's big sustainability challenges by providing practical, scalable solutions for markets and communities that are also committed to a more sustainable planet. And so, yes, we do that by focusing on trees as the solution. The recent IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, named forest management as one of only a handful of response options that deliver a medium to large size benefit that for all of the challenges that face us globally. And certification is the best way to ensure that forest is sustainably managed. Forests certified to SFI are essential at reducing the impacts of climate change because they absorb carbon from the atmosphere at very impressive rates and also are very resilient to climate impacts. SFI certified forests and forest products, therefore, are powerful tools that can be used to achieve our shared goals around carbon, climate change, and water, and an overall healthier society. And with nearly 350 million or over 350 million acres certified in North America, the US and Canada, and millions more that are positively influenced by our fiber sourcing standard, we actually have the scale that we need to achieve these goals. And so I'll give you one example of how we're doing this within the building industry, or how we're helping the building industry do this. The building industry is responsible for nearly 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Architects, builders, and their customers are really actively seeking ways to reduce buildings' overall carbon emissions. And that not only includes the operations of the building, which is the heating and cooling mechanisms of the building, but it also addresses the upstream impacts of the building materials. So take, for example, specific to commercial buildings, traditional building materials like steel and concrete have a heavy carbon footprint with the extraction and mining of the raw material, manufacturing of that then building material and getting it to the job site. Wood, on the other hand, has a lighter carbon footprint during the harvesting and manufacturing of the materials. And of course, it sequesters the carbon as it grows, in addition to, of course, storing that carbon in that building material for the entire life of the building. And so mass timber, cross-laminated timber, you'll hear maybe CLT if you run in the circles of buildings. That's the hottest advancing sector of the building industry right now. And it's a new way to build taller, relatively new in our country, to build taller buildings with wood. I won't get into the details of what it is, but this new category of building offers huge advantages to our shared goals of reducing carbon emissions. And there are many Fortune 500 companies that are looking to mass timber for their new headquarters. Walmart, for example, has committed to an entire mass timber campus going up in Bentonville, Arkansas. And so when procured responsibly from certified forests, building with mass timber also addresses many urban and rural economic development gaps. These new ways to build need to have manufacturing facilities that are located near the forests, and then also relatively ideally, right, relatively close to projects, but it helps to build up rural economic development as well. And it's the certification component that ensures that all the sustainable, scalable benefits throughout communities and our environment are achieved responsibly. Additionally, specific objectives within, for example, our forest management chain of custody and chain of custody standards speak to climate smart forestry and address carbon, climate change, species of recovery, circular economy, the UN's SDGs, and many more issues that are concerns of us all. And so really by offering better building solutions, we're helping construction projects and all the stakeholders involved reach their goals towards net zero buildings, as well as garnering benefits associated with healthier, more resilient planet. So that's just one example of many in ways that SFI, certified forest, and products help companies achieve their carbon reduction goals.
That's very cool, Annie. It's CLT, where I live in Portland, Oregon. A lot of cool buildings going up here, and forest resilience and bridging the urban-rural divide are certainly areas of core focus in this state. So thank you. Let's move on to Nicolas and moving on at Michelin. And it's very, very cool what you're working on in terms of fostering cross-sectoral collaboration, innovation, and I would love for you to dive in and share a bit with the audience.
Yes, Erik. Good afternoon to everybody. So first, I am part of Michelin, as you said, and I'm in charge of sustainable development and sustainability. And we've got our race to zero. But the question in mobility is that this race to zero is not only a race to zero CO2, but a race to sustainable mobility. That is a safer, greener, more efficient, more accessible mobility. Because all the companies working into the mobility spectrum really believe that mobility is key to human progress because it's access to health, it's access to jobs, it's access to food, it's access to culture. And very clearly what we see is that if you're alone to do the race to zero, you're not able to achieve it. You cannot do it alone because you need other companies, you need cities, you need countries, you need civil society to work together to co-construct and to create the sustainable mobility of the future. And it's where the idea of this Movin'On ecosystem came from. So Movin'On is part of the solution. It was created a few years ago by several companies. And along with Michelin, you have Microsoft, you've got Accenture, you've got BNP Paribas, you've got many others, DHL. And the idea was that beyond their individual interest, to co-construct, to co-innovate this zero CO2 mobility of tomorrow. As the other panelists said, outside our fences, it's much more difficult to act. So the only way to act is ensure that you've got all the people that in order that as a group, everything is within our fences. So it was created 5 years ago. We've got a Movin'On site, movin'onconnect.com. And there, what do we do at Movin'On? We've got first communities of interest. We gather people from companies, from cities, from countries, from NGOs, from institutions to work on particular topics that we want to tackle. For instance, we have a community of interest on last mile delivery created by Accenture, where we have the MIT, the University of Washington, we've got PepsiCo, we've got UPS and much more, where we work at the same time reducing the congestion while reducing the CO2 emissions. That's an example. We are working also with CalSTART, that is the Department of Transportation of California, the Climate Group, EV100, the Transport Decarbonization Alliance to make zero-emission freight vehicle become the norm. We work also on energy efficiency and financing the transition. And here we are working with banks, we are working with institutions, we are working with the World Bank to try to come up with policies, with investment modes that are going to foster this race to zero. We also create some learning expeditions where we benchmark between cities. There's, for instance, at the moment, a very interesting community of interest between Boston, Montreal, and Lyon, that is a city in France, where they benchmark data as an enabler of sustainable mobility and zero CO2, trying to foster solutions and design solutions. So you see, public-private is essential, and the fact that we have this ecosystem, we are able to tackle issues moving from ambition to action that otherwise a company alone or a city alone or a country alone couldn't do. What's also very interesting is we are partnering with the UN. We are part of a big, Movin'On is part of a big action plan of the United Nations called ACT, aiming at accelerating the transition in mobility towards zero CO2. So this is the first thing I wanted to share. When we are more, 1 + 1 is not equal to 2. 1 + 1 can be equal to 3, can be equal to 4, because collective intelligence helps to tackle problems that we could not tackle alone. So really, I encourage all of you to try to work in this co-innovation mode, community of interest mode, and see what, for instance, Movin'On could bring to you.
Thank you, Nicolas. That's great. It's everybody's trying to change different systems. Brian's working on the investing system, and Andy's working on the forest landscape system, the building system, and you're working on mobility and transportation, which, as you mentioned, is 28% of carbon emissions in our pre-call. So let's move to Dane, because I know you're also driving to net zero with some very, very specific targets, zero crashes, zero congestion, and other things like that GM. And would love for you to be able to talk a little bit more about all the things you're doing there.
Sure, thanks, Erik. So we have a vision for 3 zeros. So zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And the crashes and the congestion piece, Nicolas touched a bit on, but have a lot to do with autonomous vehicles and self-driving systems and shared vehicles. But I'll talk more about kind of the zero emissions piece, because I think for us as an industry, that's really important. And it starts obviously with products for us. And as a company, we're in the middle of perhaps the biggest shift in products since we were founded, over 100 years ago, as we move to an all-electric future. And that does require an enormous amount of collaboration within the company and with partners. And we've had to, in many cases, realign large amounts of resources, capital funding, and things to shift in this direction. We are doing that. I think a really important element of that is to make your business goals and your sustainability goals the same. And we've been able to do that as we look to this zero emission future. That is in some way a sustainability goal, but it's also a business goal. It's what we need to do as a company. And so it's been great for us to be able to align all of the resources internally within engineering and within product design and within purchasing towards these common goals. And that goes to a second point for us. So shifting our products is an important, in fact, the largest part of it to an electric future. Going along with that is shifting our supply chain. And we know that we need to have our suppliers come with us. It's another very significant part of our footprint. And so engaging with our supply base. So we did things like we asked them all to respond to CDP and to understand and know their own footprint. And this last year, we had 96% of their identified suppliers respond. It was huge. And they're coming on this journey with us. We've started a supplier sustainability council, actually at their request. And we meet regularly and we share ideas, we share best practices. We did workshops on energy efficiency and on renewable energy. And so this is a journey we know we need to bring them along with us. And then I'd say the third element for us is our own operations. And a big part of that for us is this journey we've been on to renewable energy. And we're well down the path. We have a goal by 2030 of being 100% renewable in North America and globally by 2040. And for us, that's really important because for electric vehicles to be zero emissions, they need to be charged with renewable energy as well. And so those two things need to grow hand in hand, and the grid needs to enable that zero emissions future. And so we've been able to work with regulators, with policymakers, with utilities, with independent producers to really enable the growth of renewable energy. And we believe that's going to be really key for decarbonization going forward for our industry, but also for everyone. So pretty excited about the opportunities and the progress so far.
Hey, Dane, thanks. We have a lot of questions coming in, some of which you've all touched on. And so I'm going to start to go through them as quickly as I can and ask for the panelists to maybe just raise a hand and respond to them. I might call on some of you. So one of the questions is really, as net zero is a big opportunity for business to innovate. And so we've heard a lot of people talk about is how do you leading companies are really moving forward on net zero, but there's a lot of laggards, small to medium-sized enterprises trying to drive change through the supply chain. How do you actually convey the getting to net zero as a real business imperative to your leadership to really encourage them to make this a priority? And what advice would you give to other businesses who may not yet be on the path? So I'm not sure who wants to answer that question first. Maybe I'll call on Brian, since you're working a lot with companies, and then Dane.
I think it helps to show what their peers are doing So, and the impacts that moving to net zero has on them. And that could be in the context of saying, here's financing options that actually, if we were to accelerate the things that we're doing related to environmental social governance, or in this case, net zero, there could be lenders out there who may be able to give us a more favorable rate. There's lots of examples out there. And that's something that's going to certainly get attention from your finance folks. You can also have a conversation, again, thinking about the story you're trying to tell about recruitment. And there's a lot of people who want to work for companies who are on this path, whether it's to net zero or more generally along the environmental social governance continuum. And if you can make that case to HR that we have a great story to tell, or we want to tell a great story, here's some examples how we've seen in our peers where they've been able to increase the quality of the recruits that have been coming into their company over time. That's going to lead to a better company for you as well. And then lastly, you could have a conversation about investors, both the investors that currently invest in your company, but also have a conversation about the investors that you would like to attract. And let's say you do want to attract those companies that, or excuse me, those investors who are focusing more on this. You can then add on a conversation about, and we present this time and time again, using not only our own indices, but also different indices, different index providers, the returns of company performance over time who focus on whether it's climate or it's ESG. Increasingly, we're seeing that they certainly track a benchmark index, but we just did an analysis on some of the leading indexes that are tracking climate and other ESG related topics. And over the last few years, they were outperforming the S&P 500. So that's a really interesting story to tell internally to get people to move along and understand that this is something that they want to do.
Cool. So attract employees, attract investors, and it leads to better performance. I think Dane had his hand up next, and then Nicolas, I see, and then I have a question for Amy.
Sure. So Brian touched on a couple of really important ones for us. Part of the question in terms of how do you bring others along with you in the journey, a really important element, I think, for this too is as you talk about the convergence with innovation and future risk, is that increasingly, if businesses aren't able to innovate and to do things differently, there's a large amount of risk, the climate risk itself, but also the regulatory and policy risk around that. And so, you may not have investors, people may not want to come work for you, but there's a very high risk in many areas of regulations impacting your ability to be successful in the future. And so you need to innovate so that you can thrive in that future and get ahead of that. And frankly, investors, I think a lot of what they are valuing is innovation. As Brian mentioned, the indices show that some of these companies are more highly valued. And certainly some of that might be because the investors are interested in the social or the environmental cause. But I think often they see those companies as more innovative and more willing to lean into doing things differently. And so that attracts those employees and those investors that you want for the future as well.
Yeah, you got to look at the turnover in the Fortune 1000 over time, and it definitely shifts pretty dramatically. So Nicolas.
Yes, to complement what Brian and Dave were saying is, from a Movin'On perspective, what's important if you want to bring everybody, startups, smaller companies, bigger companies towards net zero, you need to find what is the business model, what is the value for them. And that's why you can create on specific topics, communities of interest to try to find the value sharing model. To give you an example, if you talk about mobility as a service, we talk about it a lot. You've got many startups, small companies, and the question is, what is the business model? Then you have also big infrastructure companies that need to put some recharging devices, but where is the business model? Then you have the builders, the people who plan the cities. If you bring them together, small, big cities, etc., and you say, okay, we need to go from net to zero, but how can we extract the value from it? And how do we do the value sharing? You see that people come much more on board than if you do it only by constraint. Because today the constraint is more on the big companies because they are part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for instance, or they are on the countries because of nationally determined contributions and the Paris Agreement. But smaller companies, at the moment, they are not really blocked by regulations, laws, or etc. And that's why value sharing is extremely important.
So that's why you're applying, moving on to like different, let's say, cities in kind of a virtual race to the top. Once you
Yes.
establish the model, you can then replicate that
Yes.
across the world. So,
Mhm.
Annie, some questions came in around land use, and obviously how we manage land has a dramatic impact on climate change and restoring soil carbon and the natural soil carbon cycles. So, can you really talk more about how SFI is really trying to advance this, not only just in the lands that they help owners manage, but kind of more systemically, more broadly in policy changes and other things?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. One of the things that sets SFI apart from other certification programs is that we are the only one that we require certified companies to research and to invest in forest research. And since 1995, our certified companies have invested nearly $1.8 billion in forest research. Last year alone, 70% of that, those investments were allocated for conservation-related objectives. So because of those investments, we're able to learn a lot and begin to quantify what are the carbon benefits, savings, as you know, including the soil carbon as well, and what are what are the benefits to water and biodiversity and that kind of thing. And you talk about beyond the land of just the boundaries of our SFI certified land, we have a fiber sourcing certification, and that helps influence landowners. A lot of landowners are small landowners, family landowners, and they may harvest their land once every generation. And so they may not have a large certification system attributed to their land, but they're doing the right thing. And so we have this fiber sourcing standard that helps to ensure when mills and manufacturers are procuring fiber, that even if it's not coming from an SFI certified forest, it may in fact be coming from a responsibly managed forest. And there's certain protocol that address that as well. So in that way, we're able to expand the boundaries of what we influence.
And that's working with kind of the market certification system. And I'm just kind of curious about how do you actually even move landowners? I think one of the questions is really around how do you change public policy to kind of emphasize the things that SFI is already doing, like sustainable procurement by cities, for example, to create markets for in demand for cross-laminated timber. How do you get state and federal and provincial policies to change in a way that helps encourage better forest practices? And can you get your companies to do that?
So the companies that that may specify certified timber, they're actually like, take, for example, Mass Timber. They're doing the lobbying and the policy changes needed to allow building codes to change so that they can build higher with wood. Typically, you'd only could use stick frame, at so many high levels, 5 stories maybe. And now you can go much higher because the policies have been changed, the building codes have been changed because folks have been rightly so lobbying to show the benefits of using mass timber, which is different than stick frame. SFI, we focus on forest management standards and chain of custody and proper forest management. We don't specifically do the influencing of policy, but by nature, through our supply chain, policy is being changed in the right way.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. A couple of questions about how you manage suppliers. As part of the way we talked about trying to foster innovation and spread it to smaller to medium-sized businesses. Are there examples where you might, say, drop a supplier if they're not meeting certain targets for you? Can one of you touch on that?
So sure, I'll talk about that. As we started our work with suppliers, we started with goals that we felt were in the initial phases of them knowing their own footprint, disclosing their own footprint, setting their own goals. So we really wanted to invite them to come on the journey. We have made it very clear. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had our annual supplier meeting with over 3,000 suppliers, and the person who heads our whole supply chain organization said, we want you to join us on this journey, but it's a journey that you'll need to come on. And so if you're not planning on coming on the journey, you might need to plan on a different business partner. And so, I think he sent a very clear message to our supply base that we do and will help. We want to enable, we're doing workshops and we're offering up experts to do, we're offering up tools and processes. And so we want to do everything we can to bring them with us, but absolutely, I think there'll come a time when suppliers, if they decide to opt out of joining us on this journey, might also be opting out of that business relationship.
Our team often refers to that as the Walmart effect, when they're really driving things through their supply chain, and you either can follow through on their codes of conduct or not. And a lot of people want to get on the shelf. So it sounds like you're kind of doing something a little similar for your sector as well.
And we have the scale to help them, and so we're not trying to leave anybody behind. We want them to join us. And, we're in many cases a large enough part of business that we can help them get there. So we want them to be successful, but we also need them to come with us.
That's it. Nicolas, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that as well.
Yes. No, what I wanted to say, because I'm going to talk about what Movin'On can bring to that, and not about what Michelin is doing, because that's not the topic today. What's very interesting is each company has got a different way of doing. There are several tools that exist. Some people use what's called EcoVadis, that is the way of asking the customers to fill a form, the suppliers to fill a form, and then you rank them and you ask for action plans. There's also the Carbon Disclosure Project that is doing the CDP supply chain. That is also a way of bringing the suppliers into the momentum. And typically, what can we do in ecosystem? In ecosystem is to look with the different companies of what they are using, what are the pros and cons, and to find the best ways to engage the suppliers, because the risk, otherwise, you may kill them if you ask them to fill too many papers and fill in too many reports. And so working in ecosystem to lead you towards the kind of a norm to simplify the job of the smaller suppliers in order that they can follow you without still being able to breathe.
Got it. Thank you. That's great. Question came in that could be applied to everybody. Has COVID-19 changed how your enterprise is tackling net zero, and have you a renewed focus? I think this is certainly something every firm that we work with is struggling with. So I guess I'll call on Brian first.
I don't work specifically on S&P Global's net zero goals, but thinking about our clients, it's come up frequently in the context of we don't have employees who are commuting to work anymore. So the emissions associated with that travel, how do we know how to count it, but how do we tell our story so that we're not essentially saying, look how more efficient we are this year, when in reality it was only because of COVID-19 that we were more efficient, or the same thing with business travel. So a lot of that is still to be determined in terms of how that is presented. We're making the case that continue on your path toward net zero. Don't view yourself as ahead of where you should be, because that's not necessarily realistic. We hope that we will return to some form of normalcy at some point, maybe not exactly like we had in terms of business travel and employee commuting and people going into an office space. But let's be mindful of this is hopefully just a very large, I was about to say a blip, but I don't want to underestimate what we're dealing with this year, but we will return to normal at some point, or some semblance of that. So stay on the path and be realistic with what you're calculating.
Employees aren't commuting, so that's actually good for more sustainable mobility. So Nicolas.
Yes, so really the COVID has been kind of a lever. I haven't seen in the Movin'On ecosystem anybody who has said, because of COVID, this question of sustainable mobility are not important. They are even more important. The mobility of today is a little bit different from what it was 7 or 8 months ago. It's not the same types of mobility, but mobility is still crucial. And it's also a good moment to find other business models of the way of doing things to accelerate. And whatever is going to be tomorrow, whether it's going to be a new normal, or at least there's a conscience, I think, that things need to change. And because of that, this race to zero resonates very well with the COVID crisis, because people link it to nature or things that you don't master, and the necessity to act and to find new value, new product, new services, and to work together. And COVID is a good example of different countries, entities, companies that need to work together to solve the issue. So I would say it's a positive effect because it triggers change.
Operations happening in many places, but not quite as much in the United States, unfortunately. But as we approach this election, but the question for you related to that, Nicolas, is that and for all the panelists is there's a flip side of this. So, is there any engagement around COVID where people are actually less likely to embrace net zero or ESG targets because there's a sense of the economy's more risky and they want to actually book their revenue now, for example?
What I can tell you, I can't speak worldwide because the Movin'On ecosystem, it's big multinational companies, but they have got a big European base. And I can tell you that today in Europe, it's not the case at all. And the movement of the companies, of the countries, of the cities is globally the same all across Europe. And I've seen that in the US, in many states, in many areas, many companies that are part of the Movin'On ecosystem, I haven't seen any changes.
That's great. Brian, it looked like you might want to ask something or say something.
Sure.
Oh, I thought you
no, that's fine.
raised. Sorry.
I was peeking over to my other screen because I was preparing to be called on. So thank you. What I was trying to mention is stock performance is not indicative of economic performance. However, it is one indicator that a lot of people are looking at. And I mentioned this earlier, but what we've seen with companies that were already aligning with climate commitments, larger ESG themes, these companies' stock performance generally has been better than their benchmark. And that's indicative of better run companies who are more prepared and hopefully positions them better in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that 98% of all funds now in Europe have some kind of ESG screen. I think it's about 65% in the United States. So we're definitely lagging, but catching up. There's a few different questions around really kind of revolutionizing the energy system to enable the electric vehicle future. Dane, I think you touched on some of the work you're trying to do with utilities. It seems like there's a lot of interest among some of in the audience and understanding a little bit more how you do work with utilities as they begin to transition. As well, it's hard because they need to keep power on 24/7, and they want to move to a much more of a decarbonized energy production mix. So, can you talk a little bit more about how you work with them on that to anticipate the demand?
Sure. Yeah, and we, I think there's two key things that we're working on. One is because of the scale that we can help with our own renewable energy commitments to get the power providers to a point where they're comfortable making large investments. So this year alone, we've done over 800 megawatts of solar and wind deals that those will enable others to use renewable energy. So it allows those who are building those and investing in those to have the confidence in the security in the future that they'll build out that infrastructure. And then we're in fact, in a few weeks, we'll be talking about something we're doing to try to enable our customers and our suppliers to benefit directly from renewable energy as well, so that we can use the relationships we have, the scale we have in our customers and suppliers to help collectively build the demand for renewable energy and allow people to make those investments. And then we're working in terms of the vehicles on technology to allow battery storage and to allow to help grid operators manage some of the intermittency that they have, and looking at things like batteries as storage as well as hydrogen and the role that hydrogen can play, both electrolyzers and then fuel cells, so that we can use green hydrogen to store energy, and then use fuel cells to produce that energy and even use it for transport. So it's going to be real key for us, and it does take a lot of collaboration.
But just to rebound on hydrogen, what Dave was saying, for instance, reading the Movin'On ecosystem, we brought together, it was a few years ago, the European Commission, some infrastructure specialists, some OEMs, everybody together. We worked together, communities of interest, etc. And this led to a very big project in France for a global region, trying to create a green hydrogen infrastructure, plus a big number of public vehicles that could use this infrastructure in order that it could make sense. So in that case, we had this ecosystemic approach, which led to the development basically of hydrogen, because otherwise you're stuck because you don't have the vehicle, or you don't have the green hydrogen, or you don't have the stations, or you don't have. And so that's why it's the chicken and the egg. and the ecosystemic approach like Movin'On or any others is that you bring all the stakeholders, and in that case you don't have the chicken and the egg issue anymore, as all the stakeholders at the same time decide on moving forward on a pilot that little by little you can make bigger, 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 and bigger.
Yeah, it's this collaboration is really important, and it really gets to the importance of inclusivity and making sure that there is a just transition as we move towards a lot of adoption of a lot of these new technologies. Related to that, one of the questions came in around when would electric vehicles be really affordable at scale for the average working class person.
That's going to be a really important question, because you mentioned a just transition and the impact of COVID, and so a lot of people have. Life has gone on, with COVID. For many people, it hasn't. They have jobs that have been impacted, and there are a large number of people who are very negatively impacted, and we need this to be a transition that involves everyone and bring everyone forward. And so, affordable EVs are very, very important in that. And so, part of one of our big pushes as a company is to get the cost of EVs and the variety of EVs to where everyone can have one, but they also need to be able to charge them. And many people who live in shared housing arrangements or apartments or condominiums don't even have options to charge them. So we need both an affordable vehicle and we need charging infrastructure if we want to bring those people the same opportunity that many others have who might have their own house, their own garage, and can afford a very expensive electric vehicle.
Great point. So yes, how do we create affordable, clean buildings, affordable, clean transportation for people at scale. I see Liam Dowd chiming in here. I think we have 1 more minute. So I don't know if anybody, Annie or Brian, if you had any closing thoughts around this topic of a just transition.
I'll just say real quick to ensuring that we have all the voices at the table, and it's through that collaborations and partnerships that we bring diverse voices, and inevitably we get to innovation that way. And I just wanted to kind of remind us all of that.
Ryan, any final remarks?
Just again to echo what everyone else said, that collaboration is so important. I mean, look at the event that we're on today and the events throughout this week. These are continuing even despite the challenges of continuing to stare at screens, and events that we used to love to go to in person, now virtual. We're still coming together and sharing what we have to say.
Thank you. I think without further ado, I just want to thank all of you for taking time today, and thank Thomson Reuters for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Liam, you're muted.
Thank you. There we are. Always do it at least once on an event. So thank you, Annie, for letting me know. But Erik, Brian, Nicolas, Annie, and Dane, thank you for an excellent discussion, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good to meet everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
There we are. Next up, we're looking at the impact of the pandemic on supply chains and the increasing moves to de-risk certain parts of the supply chain by shifting to a more localized approach. Over the next 20 or so minutes, we have Tony Milliken, the Chief Sustainability and Procurement Officer at AB InBev, talking with Terry Slavin, our Editor-in-Chief at Sustainable Business at Reuters Events. Over to you, Terry.